There are people who mistake fear for prudence and call every difference a danger. In their hands, concepts become bars and names become hinges. Everything unfamiliar is folded into a label, stamped and stored away. This is the small economy of the mind: reduction for safety, classification for control. The world acquires compartments. Souls are cataloged like objects on a shelf. The act of knowing becomes an act of confinement, and compassion is replaced by the tidy logic of exclusion. But consider another posture, older than judgment and wilder than categorization: the posture of the one who drops keys. The sage in Hafiz's image stoops beneath a generous moon and slips metal into the locks of other people's making. There is no spectacle in this work, no sermonizing, only the quiet craftsmanship of liberation. Keys dropped at night are gestures of trust and stealthy gifts that soften hardened boundaries. They do not break the cage so much as reveal how it was made, and thereby invite the prisoner to stand and open the door themselves. To live in this spirit is to practice an economy of openings rather than enclosures, where the small mind asks, how can I keep certain things out? The liberating mind asks, how may I let more be in? This is less a refusal of discernment than a reorientation of its aim: to recognize the spark of vastness in each obscured soul rather than to confirm the neatness of our prejudices. When we see another as a rowdy prisoner rather than a villain, we alter the script. Rescue becomes hospitality, instruction becomes the handing over of a light, and authority dissolves into a gesture that points toward a capacity the other already contains. Metaphors are instructive here. Imagine a marketplace where merchants build walls to protect their stalls from theft. The small-hearted man piles stones high to guard his goods. The world narrows and trade suffers. Now imagine a different market where people leave gates open and exchange takes the form of trust. Theft is still possible, but generosity grows. Creativity flourishes because risk is tolerated as a component of abundance. The sage's dropping of keys is like widening thresholds in a communal square, an act that invites risk precisely because it trusts the presence of a deeper law, that when one is treated as free, one begins to act more freely. This trust is not naive. It is born from a long apprenticeship with human complexity, an acquaintance with how fear shapes posture and how shame builds secret enclosures. The wise know that coercion produces compliance, but seldom yields transformation. True liberation must be coaxed, not forced. The key the sage drops is not a tool of escape that obliterates responsibility. It is an instrument that returns agency. To hand someone a key is to say implicitly, I believe you can open your own cage. I believe a larger life is possible for you. Compassion here is tactical and ontological at once. Tactically, it recognizes the practices that sustain imprisonment: habitual shame, social ostracism, internalized narratives, and responds with targeted gestures that loosen these patterns. Ontologically, it asserts that the human soul is not fundamentally a bounded thing to be regulated, but a field of possibility that invites participation. The sacred appears not as a doctrine to impose, but as an ambient quality that arises when we treat one another as beings capable of change. There are costs and dangers. Keys can be misplaced, generosity exploited, Hearts may be taken advantage of when the world remains untransformed. But the alternative, manning the cages forever, enlarges suffering into architecture. The smaller economy wins only by shrinking human possibility. The larger ethic risks loss and returns everything essential. The recovery of dignity, the reanimation of agency, the possibility that the rowdy ones will become collaborators in the common life. So the work at hand is both subtle and relentless. To notice where we have contributed to cages, to learn the crafts of unmaking them, to keep an inventory of small keys we can drop, words that reframe a life, gestures that restore trust, presence that witnesses without quick judgment. The moon will wane and wax, and the sage will continue to duck and place keys with no expectation of applause. A single dropped key, unnoticed at midnight, may become the hinge of a morning's freedom. If cages have a language, what sound does a key make when it turns from the inside? And will you recognize that sound when it comes?
The sound of a key turning from the inside is not triumphal. It is small and exact, a little music that announces a new possibility. That tiny click, barely louder than breath, tells of a hinge unlearning its stiffness. We have imagined cages as grand constructions, iron bars, locked doors, but many of the prisons we know are quieter. A habit of thought, a rehearsed shame, a family story repeated until it seems inevitable. The sage's dropped key is not meant to smash these structures, but to invite a different relationship to them, to show that the lock was never absolute and that the hand inside still contains resource. Think of shame as a room's bad light. In dimness, the furniture becomes monstrous and corners breed assumptions. Under a steady, honest light, the same objects reveal their ordinary proportions. Keys do not always open doors. Sometimes they flip a small lamp. One who tends liberation understands this economy. Sometimes the work is not dramatic exit, but small illumination, the kind that allows a person to see themselves without the distortions that made captivity necessary. In such light, people begin to rearrange their gestures, to let old tightened muscles soften, to recognize choices they thought vanished. Cages are often communal art. Families, groups, and institutions produce the cages we internalize, rules that were never questioned, labels that grew sticky with repetition. The small man mentality polishes those rules into gospel, using them to define belonging and to exclude whatever resists tidy classification. The opposite practice, the art of dropping keys, is modest and subversive. It operates at the seams where story meets habit. A word offered in non-judgment, a question that refuses the quick verdict, a presence that tolerates contradiction. These are the keys that wear grooves into old locks until they begin to yield. There is a craft to this loosening that is as practical as it is mystical. It requires attention to context. It recognizes that freedom is not one size fits all. Some cages will open with a single key, a reframed memory, a corrective conversation. Others need patient ritual, repeated moments of safety, steady demonstration that change is possible, a slow composting of fear into trust. The wise worker prepares an array, small gestures, reliable practices, narratives that offer alternative histories. None of these is coercion. All are invitations that respect the agency of the person who might one day turn from the inside. Risk shadows each dropped key. Generosity can be mistaken for weakness. Light can reveal brittle things people prefer to ignore. The one who gives keys must accept ambiguity. Sometimes the door opens and the freed person walks away, not toward communal repair, but toward a different solitude. Sometimes keys are stolen and used to hurt others. Yet the opposite posture, fortifying every threshold, ensures a different harm, a culture of containment where possibility atrophies. The ethical balance lies not in safety by default, but in calibrated courage, in accepting vulnerability as the condition under which real transformation becomes possible. This practice reshapes the landscape of relationship. Where cages multiply, conversation contracts, suspicion replaces curiosity. Where keys are offered, a different grammar emerges, one of tentative trust, corrective hospitality, and repertory speech. Community becomes a field of experiments in liberty rather than a tribunal of identities. In such a field, people learn to hold one another with less certainty and more care. They start to listen for the small clicks of internal turning and to honor them without spectacle. Finally, there is an inner choreography. The person learning to drop keys must practice humility and discretion. The act is not publicity, it is quiet aid. It involves recognizing one's limits, understanding that not every lock is ours to open, and cultivating patience to stay near without pushing. The sage's head ducks under the moon, not to be seen, but to bend to the work. The entire enterprise depends on a soft stooping, a willingness to be the unnoticed instrument of another's freedom. If the night holds many such small interventions, what morning might arrive when the city's hidden doors no longer sound solitary clicks, but a chorus of openings?
When morning comes and the city's hidden doors no longer sound like solitary clicks, but instead form a chorus of small openings, something subtle and vast begins to change in the world's grammar. The chorus is not triumphal, it is municipal and domestic, the sound of hands learning again how to reach toward possibility. Where cages once defined neighborhood and family, thresholds now remember their original vocation, to be liminal places where passage occurs and transformation is possible. The waking is quiet, but its effect is tidal. There is a particular hush that follows such an unmaking. It is not absence of noise, but the reconfiguration of attention. People pause more often mid-sentence. They wait for the other's breath to finish its shape before offering correction. Children learn that mistakes will be received rather than punished into secrecy. The once rowdy find that their raggedness can be met without immediate repair, and so begin to trust themselves enough to try gentler experiments. The small sound of a key turning inside, repeated across many doors, becomes a cultural rhythm, low, exact, and patient. It summons a new ethos, one that prefers invitation to indictment. This is not romanticization. There are stubborn locks that resist keys, and cages that reassert their bars. Reluctance, fear, and the economics of shame do not vanish because the few keys lie on thresholds. The practical labor remains, conversations that reframe stories, rituals that mark safety, reparations that rebuild trust. Yet, the difference lies in orientation. The small man logic asks, how do we secure what we have? The releasing logic asks, how do we enlarge what can be given? One posture closes life into narrower possibilities. The other enlarges the field so that being itself can rehearse new comportments. Notice how freedom changes shape when it is practiced rather than declared. Declared freedom can be an aesthetic, a slogan for speech. Practiced freedom is messy, ordinary, stubbornly resilient. It appears in the patient repetition of small acts, a neighbor invited to speak without interruption, an apology offered without justification, a habit of naming a past wrong and then listening for its unfolding. These acts accumulate like slow architecture, and eventually, habit yields structure. Communities built by this patient labor are not perfect, but durable. They can hold contradiction and still provide table and roof. At the center of this renovation is an ethic of attention that refuses easy closure.
The sage who drops keys does not do so out of pity, but from the recognition that each person contains a potential for breath. To attend in this manner requires humility, the willingness to be the instrument rather than the hero, to allow another's turning to proceed on its own timing. It also requires courage, to keep handing keys when some locks remain stubbornly closed, to accept that generosity may be misunderstood, even weaponized. Yet the alternative to fortify every threshold ensures the possibility atrophies into a brittle system that will sooner or later fracture. There is a spiritual weather to these practices. The heart unclenches as one experiences being received rather than judged. Shame dissolves into narrative and becomes material for reweaving. As more people risk turning from the inside, the social imaginary shifts. Forgiveness becomes a plausible response. Curiosity replaces quick blame, and authority is exercised as stewardship rather than dominion. The sacred in this picture is not a distant altar, but the ordinary process by which locked hearts find their own keys and learn the economy of giving them away when others are in need. The arc of this teaching folds inward toward personal witness. Each of us must ask where in our lives we have been the mason of cages and where we might become the smith of keys. Often the cages are tender, habits of self-critique, narratives of inadequacy, roles we clutch to feel coherent. The key we drop to ourselves first is the small act of re-speaking our past without ensnaring it, calling shame by name and inviting a different memory to grow. From that interior unfastening flows outward generosity that is more authentic because it is not performative, but repaired. The final movement is less about doing than about a stance of being. To cultivate a posture that notices locks and registers their need without rushing to solve or to judge. This presence is an artistry of hesitance and readiness. Hesitance so as not to stop on another's timing, readiness so that when a hand seeks release, a key is there in a palm. Imagine a street where every doorstep glows faintly at dusk, not with lamps of ownership, but with the light of possible passage. A neighbor waiting, a friend listening, a stranger offered a nod rather than a sentence. In such a street, the air itself seems to carry less suspicion and more allowance. If the great task of compassion is to enlarge the field of belonging, then small acts of unmaking cages and dropping keys become the daily tactics of a revolution that renounces spectacle for fidelity. The sage disappears into night not because humility requires invisibility, but because the art of liberation is an economy of gifts, not of trophies. The credit is not the point, the opening is. Let the last image be patient, a night when many keys lie scattered across thresholds, their metal warm from hands that have not sought notice. In the morning, those keys will be gone, turned at last, and the doors will stand slightly ajar. In that slightness, the world opens, not by mandate, but by the slow, generous choreography of people learning again how to be free and how to let others be so. In the hush that follows, listen for the softer sounds, the turning within, the breath drawn deep, the fragile music that accompanies a life released.